Hello, everybody. One word that comes up time and time again in this show, and indeed in my written work, is the A word, agency. It's a word that, at least according to my AI, Anthropic, Claude, means self-determination, intentionality. One wonders what super agency could mean. I looked it up online. And the definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary is a large, complex governmental agency, especially when set up to supervise other agencies. In our age of Elon Musk, that definition has a particular kind of resonance. But there's another meaning of super agency. There's a new book called Super Agency, co-authored by Reid Hoffman, who you all know, and my guest, Greg Beato, who's worked with Reid Hoffman for many years. And Greg is joining us from Petaluma in the North Bay. Greg, what does super agency mean?
Let me jump into that in a second, but I should have told you in our pre-conversation that my last name is pronounced Beato.
Oh, Beato.
Just for the record.
Beato. I was going to make a Catholic joke, but I won't.
Yeah, it's like the Beatitudes. It means the Blessed One.
Good. Well, you are the Blessed One because you're the co-author with Reid of Super Agency, What Could Possibly Go Right with Our AI Future. But before we get to our AI future, define what you mean by super agency.
So, yeah, when you are talking about agency, that's our starting point. And I think it's important to make that distinction because these days there's also a lot of talk about AI agents, right? And that's an instance of an AI system that is going out and working autonomously on your behalf and accomplishing things that you want it to do, but you're not there every step of the way with it. And there's been a lot of talk in recent months that 2025 is the year of the agent. So when people see super agency, they sometimes think we're talking about that. We touch on that in the book, and I'm sure Reid will be talking about it a lot through 2025. But we're starting with that description or definition of agency that you just said, which is basically this idea that you have self-determination over your own life and you can set intentions, make plans, and then take actions to realize those intentions. Super agency, we assert in the book, is what happens when not just a few people, but millions of people get access to a new tool that gives them new capabilities and even superpowers. And so what ends up happening is you start to benefit not just from your own increased agency, but the agency of everyone else who is also benefiting from this tool. We've seen this happen over the years. The examples that we sort of use in the book are early 20th century, the fast uptake of automobiles, especially in the US, created a kind of super agency when you didn't even have to be an automobile driver at a certain point to start benefiting from the fact that all these people had this new superpower. Doctors could suddenly do more house calls per day and go longer distances. All kinds of things happened because of that improved life for everyone in sort of synergistic ways. Smartphone, same sort of phenomenon. And now we think that's true with AI. If AI is developed and designed in ways that enhance that goal.
Greg, do you think, and this is something I've given quite a lot of thought to, and I always touch on in these kind of conversations, given that agency, we have to thank our friends at Anthropic for this definition, is built on self-determination, intentionality, responsibility, all the core Protestant virtues that Max Weber, of course, famously wrote about in The Protestant Ethic and the Origins of Capitalism. Is there something coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, connected between American values and the quote unquote values of AI? Is it not quite as revolutionary as some people might think? Is it conforms to the original values or ideals or promises of individual agency, particularly male agency of the American Republic?
I'm trying to follow that one through. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I think in the sense that if you're saying that, yes, AI is designed primarily to enhance individual agency, I guess you could make that argument. We're not saying that it's primarily designed to do that. Our contention in the book, in fact, is that when ChatGPT came out, it was actually the first time that people had broad access to a general purpose AI tool that they could use in ways of their own devising, right? Like we've been developing in this new era of machine learning different kinds of AI systems for over a decade, and they were showing up all kinds of different ways, like in algorithmic decision making, with your bank is determining if you get a mortgage, in a lot of criminal justice settings in terms of who gets parole or what bail should be set at, predictive policing, facial recognition, and then of course just in things like newsfeed curation and autocomplete, right? So
yeah, I mean, I always thought that Google itself, as the paradigmatic search engine, I mean, that's an example of AI. Now it seems rather primitive, but when it came out in 1999 or 1998, it was quite revolutionary.
Yeah, and I think it continued to evolve over time and incorporate even more different kinds of algorithms and more sophisticated uses of AI. And and the point that we make in the book is that some of those uses can be good. Some of them maybe depending on what role you're playing in the scenario, not so good. None of them were ones that you as a user were making an affirmative choice on to say, I want to be using this and this is how I want to be using it. And if you go back, I'm old enough so that I remember going to CompUSA, and like to get some software on your computer, you had to go buy it, install it. You were making all the decisions about how you wanted your.
Those were the days, Greg. We were just talking about them before we went live.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of good things that have happened in the shift, right? In terms of.
So let me revise the question, because
Okay.
maybe I didn't make it as clear as I should have. My question was that the values that you're celebrating in Super Agency, because this is a book that's unusually optimistic about AI. Most of the books these days on AI tend to be more pessimistic. So I think your book is actually quite refreshing in that sense. But what you're celebrating in some ways about self-determination and intentionality are the same values that the founders of the American Republic celebrated and tried to protect with their Bill of Rights and democracy and all the rest of it. So my question is that just coincidental, or do you think the fact that you and I are both in California, Reed is a Californian, AI was pretty much invented or at least pioneered in the United States, is that coincidental?
I don't think it's coincidental. I think, and this is something I didn't know before we started working on the book, but some of my, first instances of trying to get more contextual awareness, I found this basically the first blog post that OpenAI published in 2015 when it was introducing, itself to the world. And it talked about saying that it wanted to develop AI in a way that prioritized individual wills. I'm probably getting that slightly wrong, but it was basically an expression of individual liberty, I think they said. And I thought, again, that was interesting precisely because so much of the public discourse around AI in that time, in the years that follow, roughly, I'm going to say like 2015 to 2020, there, the sort of standard narrative that was coming out of a lot of academic coverage of AI was that it was this thing that was going to consolidate power and centralize power, and and that was why we focused specifically on this idea of agency, because an individual agency, because that was sort of counter the narrative that had been the conventional wisdom, I would say, in that period, right? Of that, oh, it's going to entrench big tech even further. It's going to consolidate power into the hands of a tiny number of tech companies, and it's going to sort of immiserate the broad public, and also, create this new world where they are manipulable. And so this notion of, no, it's actually something that could be used to enhance individual agency seemed interesting to explore. And it seemed to correlate with Reed's history of, like, LinkedIn is both it obviously celebrates networks and your, who are your colleagues, and that whole sort of group aspect of career, but it's also a way for individuals to increase their economic opportunity.
It's an interesting, Reed, everybody knows, is one of the few tech brothers who wasn't on Trump's inauguration stage. He was very much involved with PayPal in the beginning, was a friend, I think, of Thiel and Musk and all the others, but now he's much more of a progressive. I spent a little bit of time with him, and I'm struck with his own particular self-determination and intentionality. I remember him telling me some years ago that he chose not to drive because he likes to sit at the back of a car and not waste time and work. My point on this, Greg, is that it's all very well creating technology that compounds self-determination and intentionality and efficacy and responsibility. There may be some truth to that when it comes to AI and super agency. But we're all different in how we use it. A lot of people will use AI to look up pornography or add to their social media presence, whereas highly disciplined, highly efficient and intelligent people like Reid Hoffman will use it to benefit themselves. So is there, in a sense, even in your optimistic take, is it a winner-take-all world where a few Reid Hoffmans will use super agency to benefit themselves one way or the other, maybe morally, maybe otherwise, and most of the rest of us will just fritter it away? Because the same was said about social media. The same was said about the internet. It was supposed to democratize, but supposed to give everyone the same power, but which may in a sense be true, but it's nonetheless compounded inequalities.
I would say it's very much true. I mean, in my perspective, the past 30 years has been a fast and slow triumph of individualism over institutions, and not always for the best, right? And I guess I want to also point out that we talk about individual agency as a starting point, but not an end point. You talked about the founding fathers and their emphasis on that, and they also did not have individual agency as the end point, right? We were a union and a republic and a democracy. There is some sense of the social and common bonds, and that's really it. Reed is known for being optimistic and forward-looking, and somewhat idealistic, I would say. And so, one way to shorthand this book is to say it's the optimistic take on AI, and it is that. But I also, from my perspective at least, there's an underlying, at the very least, let's say, wariness of where are we headed as a country in this particular moment with this particular technological revolution about to happen and are already happening, and how can we set ourselves up for a possibility of a good outcome. And a lot of that's predicated on this notion of, AI isn't going to change things just a little bit. If it plays out the way it seems it's going to play out, it's going to change things significantly. We make the assertion that we're in another steam power moment in the book.
Yeah, I don't think many people would disagree with that, either the critics or the supporters. In The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt's best-selling book about social media, he also talks about agency, but describes it as something that men tend to value and have over women. Do you think, in your analysis, in your book, Super Agency, will men and women use AI and the technology of this new radical revolutionary force? Will they use it differently, do you think? Will they use it to sort of confirm their own biases?
I don't know that there's an obvious reason why they should use it differently. I do know that a lot of the mostly academic scholars who have pointed out a lot of the let's say shortcomings of AI in the short term, like when they were talking about, well, there's a lot of bias baked into the system, or it's not as objective and neutral as it seems, or it's being played off. I guess what I'm saying is a lot of the most valuable criticism in that period that I'm talking about, 2015 through 2020, was written by women. So
yeah, and we've had a number of them on the show, so that may not be coincidental. It's an important point, I think.
But I don't think. I think the broad effort of making these tools accessible and general purpose, so that you get to use them in ways that make sense to you. I don't see how that would be gendered in some way.
Your book is a joint project, you and Reid Hoffman, and of course Anthropic and the other AI platforms also. I'm not sure if you use them for the writing of the book, OpenAI, ChatGPT, all the others. I wonder what your collaboration with Reid tells you about the future of writing in an AI age. A lot of people say, well, AI will replace authors like Greg Beato, maybe not Reid Hoffman because he's not primarily an author and he probably doesn't need to be paid for this book. But Greg, you, I think, probably do. What did the partnership tell us? Could you imagine partnering with Claude or Gemini as opposed to Reid Hoffman for this book?
Well, I do thank Claude, ChatGPT, and Gemini in my acknowledgments. So I definitely use them a lot, primarily ChatGPT and Claude, both kind of I often have them both open at the same time while I'm writing.
Claude is called Claude, not Claudia. Back to our other conversation about men and women. Maybe they should have called it Claudia.
Well, if you look at the earlier iterations, the first sort of AI, entities, Siri and Alexa, were semi-gendered as women, and
Well, they
there's
tend to fail, ironically enough. I don't know what the next versions are.
there's a lot of interesting things to talk about as to what level of anthropomorphization has been seen as the right level at any given time and how that's evolving. And I think part of that is how are they presented as, like, obviously none of these things have a gender, right? And they'll all tell you that
Well,
too.
although some of our critics would argue that they are, because they're programmed or fed by men, they reflect male values.
Sure. But I mean how it's presenting to itself and what kind of reinforcement training.
So back to the question of your relationship with Reed. You obviously had a lot of backwards and forwards with him. You've worked with him for many years. He's worked with you, so you know each other pretty well.
Right.
What does that tell us about the future of human writers? A lot of concern, as you know, Greg, amongst journalists and writers, that AI will make us all, including you and I, redundant. I know in the book you refer to Plato's Phaedrus, where Socrates, at least, was rather critical of the written book as a man who sat in the square, the polis in Socrates in Athens and talked to other Athenians. Does it make you more hopeful about the future of the writer?
Yeah, well, so when ChatGPT first came out, that was the first response, right? Or it's not necessarily going to kill writers, but they were like, it's going to kill the college essay, which essentially meant it's writing for you. And there was a lot of what I call magic button AI, right? With this notion that if you do the right exact prompt, you can get the essay in one shot. I'm sure if you mentioned that you use, I mean, we saw that you used it at least to get the definition. We didn't get to hear your theme song on the opening of the show, but you clearly must have used Suno or
yeah. You've shamed me, Greg.
I love your theme
Some
song.
people think those are real humans.
I was anticipating it. I love that stinger.
And you and I both have a music background. We're both in music startups in the 90s, so we're all too familiar with that world.
Yeah, but so
you're optimistic about the future of writers?
Yeah, what I was going to say is that when I started using it, I thought, oh, it's not writers that are obsolete, it's editors, right? Because that's how I use it as an editor. Like, here's what I've written. What do you think of it? What's a better way to say this? And it's almost as if I'm interviewing it, which in a way is really just me interviewing myself, right? So it's almost like I've become a collaborator with myself when I'm writing. And that's how I do think it's going to get better. It's probably going to get better and better.
Yeah, I'm struck with the annoyingly inoffensive nature of these AIs. Is I always want descriptions with a bit of edge that will outrage, upset, anger, stimulate, and they are very obstinate in refusing to do that. Maybe it's because all the big platforms don't want to be sued, or maybe because they're creating, it's like fast food, something so generic that everyone will be able to use it.
I think it's different. I mean, depending on how you prompt it, you can get different outputs. I still think it's really hard to get something that feels genuinely creative, but and especially in a sustained way. And I think right now the best way to use AI for creative work is writing, because it's the only form where you can really do things iteratively. With Suno, for example, you can do a one shot on the song, but as far as I know, you can't say, oh, actually, I like that song, but I want a different kind of a bass fill here or whatever, right? Whereas you can kind of do that with writing.
Can you disagree with AIs? Did you have disagreements with Reed? Did you have arguments about how you should structure the book, what you should and shouldn't say? You completely, so to speak, on the same page as him?
I think when especially with this project where my name is on the cover too, we both it's there was some level of, all right, that's what you think and that's what you think, if that makes sense. We're in pretty much, closely aligned, but there are some parts that's more Greg and some parts that's
so
more
who is
Reed.
more or less optimistic? Is Reed more or less optimistic than you on, I mean, in terms of the subtitle, what could possibly go right with our AI future?
Right. Well,
who is more convinced of that, you or Reed?
I think Reed for sure. I think
So you're more of a skeptic.
I come from a journalist background and an almost academic background, and so I think fundamentally, and Reed obviously comes from he wanted to be a philosophy professor and then decided he could have more impact, doing entrepreneurial software projects.
He might have made a bit more money as well.
But my point is that he's fundamentally more entrepreneurial, and if you're entrepreneurial, you're going to be a little bit more optimistic, right?
Do you think that I've written several books. I've never written a book with anyone else. I'm sure no one would want to write a book with me. But do you think that, and this comes back to my critique of a lot of these AIs, is they sound very generic. They don't have much personality. Do you think partnering in a book takes away the individuality out of a book?
It could a little bit, because again, it's compromise, right? And so, but on the other hand, like that's kind of standard operating procedure for screenwriting, and whether it's for movies or TV, whatever, right? Those are often written by committee, and you can still come up with something that has a ton of personality. And so I don't think it's a given, but I do think that it's going to be a little bit different, right?
Yeah, you've got some very creative ideas in the book. I don't mean to suggest that that it's lacking personality. You have an interesting reference to the Donner Party, which of course is famous in California, the group of people who ate themselves because they got so hungry walking to California. What does the Donner Party tell us about why we should be optimistic about AI?
Well, that's not so much about AI in particular as it is about one of the challenges we identify in the book, again, is how are we think it's more important than ever to make sure that the broad public is playing a role in developing these technologies, specifically because it's these are big changes. You want what has traditionally been called consent of the governed. That was a phrase Thomas Jefferson coined, and because in part this is the first major technology that is being rolled out while the internet exists, right?
Yeah, Douglas Rushkoff, who was an old friend of mine, has been on the show lots of times. I did an interview with him a couple of months ago, and he described AI as the first native app of the internet. And in his own uniquely Rushkoffian way, I think he nailed it.
Yeah, well, it kind of is a logical extension of everything the internet has put into place. But to get back to the Donner Party, the reason we invoke that is just because when you're talking about agency, you're talking about personal freedom in some respect, right? And so as we contemplate this world where machines, whether it's just pure software systems or actually sort of smart machines and devices of various ways, if they're starting to do decision making in more ways, is that going to impact your agency? A perfect example, you live in San Francisco. there's Waymos everywhere now, right? Like
Yeah, no need to tell me. And I ride a bike, so I take advantage of them because they're determined not to run me over, in contrast with most of San Francisco's drivers.
with human drivers, right? So that you could say is taking away agency from a human driver. But the point we're trying to make in the book is that we definitely in the US have this tradition of basically thinking of freedom in terms of absence of constraints on your behavior. And like,
And that's where Reed may distinguish himself from some of his libertarian friends, or maybe ex-friends, the David Sachs and the Mark Andreessens of the world.
Right.
And I think with self-driving cars, of all the examples, it's the one which is most compelling. I mean, clearly self-driving cars are a major advance given pollution, given the waste of time. I talked about Reed never driving himself.
Right.
Given injuries in car crashes. So clearly that's a good example of where a super agency is a good thing.
Well, and it's a different kind of, so for example, if you're in the back of a Waymo, you don't have the decision to, I'm going to go 10 miles faster for this stretch of time, but you then have this new freedom to read a book during your commute, right? So with the Donner Party, we were just trying to, in some ways, what we present them as in the book is they're these icons of rugged individualism, right? They had nothing constraining them on that journey. There was no laws, no speed limits, no security cameras tracking them along the way, no credit cards creating a data trail for them. So they were, the epitome of freedom in one way, right? But it took them 6 months to go 2,000 miles. Most of them didn't make it. They, the way we put it in the book is that they had to resort to the ultimate form of communism to survive. They ate each other. And today you could jump in a car with very little planning and replicate that journey in about 30 hours.
Yeah, and we've all done it. It's a beautiful journey. Speaking of communism,
I just want to say that's a new kind of freedom, right? Like that's an incredible freedom, but it only came out of the fact that we also have a lot of laws about speed limits and seat belts and everything that could be seen as constraints. But in fact, we have much more freedom and therefore much more agency to exert our dreams than the Donner Party did.
Yeah, so in the Donner Party, it was a kind of primitive communism, as George Orwell famously said in Animal Farm, some are more equal than others. And you bring up Orwell's other dystopian novel, which often comes up in these kind of conversations, 1984. But you argue that Orwell got it wrong, at least about AI in terms of devices and how we talk to one another. Why do you use Orwell's 1984 in super agencies to suggest that AI might not actually result in the kind of dystopia that many people are predicting?
Right. Well, because that book came out in 1948. It just happened to be the 75th anniversary of its publication last year while we were writing the book. And so I was seeing a lot of publicity about it over the course of the year. And, when you go back and look at all the records and journalistic accounts of how new waves of technology were greeted, it's like a constant theme. In the 60s, we start off in the book talking about this when mainframes made possible this idea of a national data bank. They had Senate hearings that this was going to compromise freedom and personal liberty in America. And so they didn't build the national data bank. And lots of the editorials at the time were like, this is Orwell, this is Big Brother, right? And then if you look in the 70s, you can find constant references to Orwell, Big Brother. It's finally going to happen in the 80s, in the 90s. It's still a best-selling novel today. Super Agency made the USA Today bestseller list this week. And so they have just a list of the top 150 books, not, classified in any way. And there are two different versions of 1984 are on that list, right? So like it's a persistent notion that we are always on the verge. We've been on the verge of dystopia for the last 75 years. And the proposition is that big government or possibly big business is going to make us compliant through technological surveillance, right? And that idea is just as current today as it was 75 years ago. What we argue in the book is that even though that's been the future that's been prophesied all along, the exact opposite has happened in terms of what we've really gotten from all this technology and technological innovation is increasing degrees of individual power, and we see that manifest in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I know that you go after, so to speak, Shoshana Zuboff. I actually blurbed her Age of Surveillance Capitalism book a few years ago. You disagree with her. You have some positive examples in the book of AI startups that you think offer a better world. Talk to me a little bit about this. One of the companies is Remesh. Another, borrowing from the idea of the polis, or the ideal of the polis, is POL.is. Why are Remesh and POL.is so promising for our AI future?
Well, both of them are instances of, everyone says, oh, we got it wrong with social media because we incentivized engagement, and the way that engagement was pursued was to really create, controversy and rage and polarization. And there's, definitely some truth to that. And so the question then becomes, well, what are some kind of social platforms that would broadly enable public participation without devolving into those kinds of, what we see as shortcomings and flaws of prior generation of social media platforms. So both Remesh and Polis are platforms that, look to create, look to facilitate collective decision making, but in ways that reduce the possibility of just devolving into, you're a liar, you're fake news, you are, you have this bias, you have that bias. It's looking for ways to, how can you architect, possibilities of consensus and deliberation versus just raw in.
So these companies, we at the beginning of these cycles, we had it with social media, we had it with the internet. We always have these examples of companies that people consider promising. So you brought up Remesh and POL.is. But do these companies have any traction?
It's always difficult, right? Because
is that your way of saying no?
Polis, it's hard to see how much traction it has because it doesn't exist in a public freestanding way.
Yeah, I mean, they describe themselves as a real-time system for gathering, analyzing, and understanding what large groups of people think in their own words. I mean, that's what Google is, isn't it? And that's what OpenAI is.
No, it's actually more of a platform for, it's almost, I would say, not it's like Twitter in the sense that you are making declarative statements, but you can't respond to other people's statements. So when you say it's
Well, we
like
know what happened
Google,
with Twitter. Now it's
well,
X, of course.
I don't I don't mean it like that. Like it's not that. It's what I'm trying to say is that it's not just because when you said it's like Google, no, Google is aggregating what people are saying in different places, right? And that's what OpenAI is doing too. This is actually convening people and creating an architecture for them to converse in a way that limits the possibilities of just evolving into name calling and rancor and that
Yeah,
kind
and
of.
I mean, we all like ideas like remesh and pol.is, but the reality, let's end here, Greg, and you don't need me to tell you this, is the reality is it's the big players who are doubling down on massive AI spending, billions, tens of billions of dollars now being poured into this by Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Meta. None of them are paragons of morality. Google just announced that they were dropping their previous restrictions on AI defense contracts. They're no better or worse in my mind than the others. Why should we? I respect your optimism, and I think it's good to have a counterintuitive take on AI when there are so many negative takes. But why should we trust these big companies? Whether it's Reed was the co-founder of OpenAI. He knows Sam Altman all too well. He's now on the board at Microsoft, who's a major player in this. Why should we trust the OpenAIs, the Microsofts, the Googles, the Amazons, even the Anthropics of this world? They've never come through in the past. They're becoming increasingly powerful and profitable. What makes us, why should we have any more faith in them than we have in the past?
Well, I can't persuade you of that. I can tell
you might be able to. It was a question rather than a comment.
All right. Well, I would say that I have a lot of trust in Google, and I actually
You do?
I use it all the time. For
well, so do I, but I still don't trust it.
Well, I guess what I mean is that it provides a lot of value to me, and I haven't really. I used to be very skeptical of it, right? Because it was like, oh, yeah.
No, but my question, in all seriousness, Greg, my question is, okay, the platform is okay, and the search engine's good, and their AI is very good. But morally, why should we trust companies like Google, who just announced this week that they're dropping their previous restrictions on involvement with AI defense? They all seem to be now jumping into bed with a certain Donald Trump. I mean, as we noted earlier, Reid Hoffman was one of the few multi-billionaires of Silicon Valley who didn't show up to the Trump inauguration. Why should we trust these companies?
Well, I think what's happened is there was a certain, what became permissible or not permissible, and that's shifted, right? And so in part, they're probably dropping those things to signal to not seem like they are in opposition to the government. But it also might be that they made those decisions not to do those things because they thought that was the way to signal to the previous administration that, we're someone that you should look upon favorably. I guess my question to you would be, do you think it would be that we don't want the US military to have good AI tools where other countries then might have them?
It's a good question from Greg Beato, co-author of Super Agency. Maybe that can be the subject of your next book with Reid Hoffman, Greg.
Well, it's not a particular interest of mine, but I think that's basically the question.
Reid did actually. He did make a comment this week on DeepSeek, which is the new Chinese heavyweight player in this, he argues that DeepSeek proves why the US must stay ahead. So even he's somewhat hawkish on what some people see as the Chinese threat. So this is a complicated subject.
Yeah, and it's what we talk about in the book is obviously there's a big China and the US are the two biggest players. But what DeepSeek also proved is that, like, what if those, whoever were the, I'm just picking a number, but the 5 engineers who figured out this new way to train it that made it so economical, they could have been in Estonia, they could have been in India, they could have, you know what I mean? And so the big question is, like, this is a multiplayer global game. And if we want to, we want to be leading the technologies. So that gives the US more agency to determine, like, well, then how do you regulate the technologies globally? What are the norms that you try to create?
Yeah, so we need super agency to deal with super agency. Greg Beato is as well positioned as anyone to tell us that, since he's the co-author of it with Reid Hoffman. Super agency, what could possibly go right with our AI future? It's a refreshingly optimistic take on our AI future. Greg, thank you so much. We'll have you back on the show. Lots more to talk about in our AI age. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking with you.